On the night of May 31st, 2003, 37-year-old Sandy Razzo stood behind the bar at the Green Iguana Bar and Grill, not far from the beach in Rocky Point, Florida. The summer crowds had already started arriving in waves to the area, and so the place that night was totally packed. Music was blaring, people were dancing and shouting, and the line at the bar just kept getting longer. Sandy saw a man wave her down, so she walked over to him, she leaned across the bar so she could hear his order over the music, and then she smiled. And Sandy's smile showed off her perfect teeth that seemed even whiter than they really were because of her very bronze-tanned skin. She also had long hair with blonde highlights and the body of someone who worked out all the time. And when she was younger, Sandy had worked as a fitness model, and she still had dreams of becoming a movie star someday. Because of her looks, men at the bar often made it a point to order their drinks from Sandy instead of one of the other bartenders, and the men almost always told her how pretty she was. And that night was no different. Sandy poured the man his drink and slid it across the bar to him, and right away he told her she was totally beautiful and he left her a great tip. Sandy smiled again and then moved on to the next customer. Sandy used to love all the attention she got from men at the bar, but over the last year or so, she had stopped trusting people, especially men, like she used to. So she had started to keep her guard up a little more at work. For most of her life, Sandy had always thought the best of people, and she believed that when you treated others with kindness, they would do the same to you. But that had all changed for Sandy about a year earlier after she'd had a horrible experience with a man who she thought was one of her best friends. That man, Tracy Humphrey, had been a part-time bouncer at the last place Sandy had worked as a bartender. Tracy was this big 6'2" tall, bald guy who looked like a big weightlifter. He was actually known as Mr. Clean because he looked like the big bulky guy on the labels of Mr. Clean cleaning products. Tracy and Sandy had first bonded over their love of fitness, and when Sandy found out Tracy worked as a trainer at a gym, she had started taking classes from him. Sandy also loved that Tracy had connections to Hollywood. He claimed he'd been the stunt double for the action movie star Vin Diesel, and that he had worked as Tom Cruise's personal bodyguard. And when Sandy would tell her friends that she still dreamed of acting in movies someday, Tracy was one of the only ones who told her that her dream really could still come true. And so Sandy had hoped that she and Tracy would be friends forever, because they got along so well and he supported her dreams and she always felt relaxed and safe with him. But then, one night, when they had been hanging out at Sandy's place, Tracy had tried to pressure Sandy into having sex with him. Sandy got upset and said that was not what she wanted, and she made that clear to Tracy. But when Sandy turned him down, Tracy had gotten angry and gone into a rage. And so, soon after that incident, Sandy had left that job and started working instead at the Green Iguana, so she wouldn't have to see Tracy anymore at work. But even after she had quit, Tracy had kept calling her and bothering her. But by May of 2003, the calls had finally stopped. Sandy heard a rumor that Tracy had started dating a 20-year-old woman named Ashley, so she thought maybe that meant he would leave her alone for good. From behind the bar at the Green Iguana, Sandy could see the crowd was finally starting to thin out. Her feet were aching from standing up all night, and she was excited her shift was ending and she could finally go home. A little while later, she checked in with her manager to say she was leaving, she counted her tips for the night, and then walked through the kitchen towards the back of the building. While Sandy was getting ready to leave, people outside were making their way from one bar to the next, and music was pumping from dance clubs and from parties all across the beach nearby. But a short, bearded man wearing baggy jeans, a sweatshirt, and a baseball cap blocked out all that noise and walked straight down the sidewalk in front of the Green Iguana. The bearded man pushed his way through a crowd of people and then headed around the building to the large parking lot in back. Once the bearded man got to the parking lot, he climbed into his Volkswagen Beetle car and closed the door. Then he leaned over to the back seat and grabbed a rifle that he'd stashed there. Then the bearded man picked up a pair of old jeans on the passenger seat and slid the barrel of the rifle through one of the pant legs to conceal the barrel when he raised the gun. The bearded man lowered the passenger side window, stretched across the car, and propped the now concealed barrel of the rifle on the open window, and then watched patiently at the back door of the Green Iguana. It was hot in the car and he could feel sweat dripping down his forehead from under his hat, but he just kept on focusing on that back door. Then finally, Sandy, who had just finished her shift, came out the back door. As soon as the bearded man saw her, he raised his rifle up and aimed it right at her and fired. The bearded man heard glass break and he saw Sandy look around wildly around the parking lot. The bearded man was confused for a second, but then he realized he hadn't hit Sandy. He had missed. He'd shot the side mirror on his own car. The bearded man panicked and looked around to see if anyone had seen him. Then he tossed the rifle into the back seat, started up his car, and sped off. Back in the parking lot, Sandy got into her black BMW convertible like nothing had happened. She'd heard the glass break, and she'd heard the shot most likely, and the car speeding off, but she just kind of figured that maybe some drunk guy had smashed a bottle somewhere and then driven away. She didn't realize she had been shot at. So, inside of her car, Sandy started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and headed home. And after about a 25-minute drive, Sandy arrived in her quiet, well-lit neighborhood and pulled up to the 2-story townhouse she shared with her friend, Tony Ponycall. Then she parked her car in the garage and went inside. Tony got home not too long after her, and they both stayed up for a bit talking, and then eventually Sandy went up to bed and fell asleep, not realizing that earlier that night, someone had tried to kill her. The following month, Sandy spent most of her time at work or hanging out with her friends, and she was having fun and making good money, and she felt like her life was moving in a really positive direction. But as good as things were going for her, she'd started to worry a little bit about Tony, the man she lived with. It had become clear to Sandy that Tony was in love with her, and he wanted to be more than just roommates. And Sandy admitted to some of her friends that she kind of liked Tony too. He was sweet, he worked hard, and he treated Sandy like a queen. And the two of them had even gone on a few dates. But after what had happened to Sandy with Tracy, she still wasn't ready to fully trust anyone. And so Sandy had told Tony that she didn't want to have a serious relationship with him and that they were great as friends and roommates, but they should both be able to date whoever else they wanted. Tony said he understood, but there were still times he acted like they were a couple, and that concerned Sandy. On July 5th, over a month after the secret failed shooting in the parking lot, Tony and Sandy hung out for a little while at their townhouse before Sandy left for work. And when she left, Tony told her to have a great day, and everything seemed good between them. And Sandy hoped Tony was finally okay with just being friends and roommates again. And when Sandy got to work, any thoughts about Tony quickly disappeared because the bar was so crowded that all she could think about was the next drink she had to make. July 4th weekend at the bar made other summer weekends look tame in comparison. And Sandy could feel her legs burning and her back aching as she made her way up and down the bar pouring drinks for what seemed like a never-ending line of customers. But even though she was tired and busy, she was still in a great mood because everyone was making a lot of money that night and all of the customers seemed like they were really having a great time. And then, after working non-stop for hours, Sandy's shift ended at about 10:30 p.m. So she counted up her tips, she said goodnight to everybody, walked through the kitchen, out the back door, and into the parking lot. And when Sandy stepped outside, she immediately heard a loud bang! And right away, Sandy was startled, but then she looked up and saw it was just fireworks exploding over the beach. Sandy smiled, climbed into her car, and headed home. And a little after 11 p.m. that night, Sandy pulled onto her street that was lined with small homes and townhouses just like hers, and she noticed how quiet everything was. She figured everybody must still be out, or they must have gone to bed early after partying the day before on July 4th. Sandy pulled into her driveway, she opened her garage door, and parked her car inside of the garage. She turned off her car's engine, pulled her keys out of the ignition, and leaned over to grab her purse on the passenger seat. But while she was leaning over, she heard something slam against the driver's side window. Sandy turned to see what had made the noise, and a look of fear came across her face. Then Sandy screamed, raised her feet up, and began kicking the driver's side door over and over and over. A few minutes after Sandy had gotten home, her roommate, Tony, flipped on the light in their kitchen. Tony was tan with short brown hair, and he was only wearing boxer shorts. He'd expected Sandy to stay out late that night, so he'd gone up to bed. But when he heard something going on in their garage, he headed back downstairs to see if Sandy had gotten home. So Tony walked across their kitchen and opened the door that led out to the garage, and he saw Sandy's black BMW parked right there. But he didn't see Sandy in the car. Tony shouted her name in case maybe she was outside out front of their property, but she didn't yell back. So Tony took a few steps into the garage towards Sandy's car, then he leaned forward and looked in through the passenger side window, and right away his breath caught in his chest. In the car, Tony saw Sandy lying slumped over the center console, and her car seats were covered in blood. Immediately, Tony ran around to the driver's side of the car, and as he did, he felt glass pierce his bare feet, and he saw the driver's side window was shattered. Tony shook off the pain in his feet, he opened the door and climbed inside. He pulled Sandy into his arms and tried to talk to her, but she was unresponsive. Then Tony reached into Sandy's jean pocket, grabbed her cell phone, and dialed 911. The emergency operator picked up, and right away, a look of complete calm suddenly came across Tony's face. And when the operator asked him what was wrong, Tony said in a slow, steady voice that his girlfriend was bleeding in her car and he couldn't wake her up. At about 11:30 p.m., 15 minutes after Tony had made that 911 call, Detective Scott Golcheski of the Pinellas Park Police Department was sitting on the couch at his house when his cell phone rang. Ski, as everybody called Detective Golcheski, had spent a relaxing weekend celebrating the 4th of July. But as soon as he heard his phone ring late at night, he knew his relaxing weekend had just come to an end. Ski answered the phone and had a quick conversation with his boss, and a few minutes later, he was on the road heading to Sandy's townhouse. As Ski drove through the neighborhood and turned onto Sandy Street, he was a little surprised this was the call he'd gotten. On a holiday weekend, his first thought had been that maybe something had happened in the part of town where a bunch of people were drinking at the clubs and bars. But when he parked in front of Sandy's townhouse on her quiet street, he figured he was most likely dealing with a domestic dispute that had turned violent. Ski stepped out of his car and walked up Sandy's driveway. He was in his late 30s, and he was average height with broad shoulders and short brown hair. He'd lived in Florida for years, but he'd grown up in New York and had never lost his New York accent. Ski heard one of the officers who was already on the scene call out his name, so he walked towards them in the garage and saw Sandy's black BMW. Glass from the shattered driver's side window was all over the ground, and Ski saw bloody prints from someone's bare feet. And when he looked in the car, he saw the seats and floorboards were spattered with blood. The officer who had called him over told Ski that a woman in her 30s, Sandy Razzo, had been shot in her car. The victim had been rushed to the hospital, but she had been pronounced dead not long after her arrival. Ski asked who had called 911, and the officer said Sandy's boyfriend. And he also said a cop at the hospital told him that the boyfriend had followed the ambulance to the hospital in his own car before police had arrived at the townhouse. Ski made a mental note of that. There was nothing strange about a boyfriend rushing off to the hospital where his girlfriend had been shot, but police must have been very close behind the ambulance, and so he wondered if maybe the boyfriend had wanted to get away before having to face the cops. Then, a ballistics expert on the scene walked over to Ski and pointed out where they had found multiple shell casings in the car and in the garage. And Ski realized that whoever had shot Sandy made little or no effort to cover their tracks. And Ski thought that could indicate one of two things. Someone had either seen the shooter in the act, and so the shooter had panicked and ran, or the shooter had very little experience with firearms and didn't understand all the evidence a gun could leave behind. Ski wanted to test out his first theory and see if anyone had caught the shooter in the act, so he and a few other officers started going door to door in the neighborhood to ask questions. But Sandy's neighbors had either been out when the attack took place, or they had already gone to bed, and so nobody had heard or seen a thing. So after canvassing the neighborhood, Ski went back to Sandy's townhouse. He and the other officers had already been in there for hours, but he told himself he wasn't going to sleep until he was sure they had found every piece of evidence possible at the crime scene. By 6:30 a.m. on July 6th, so about 7 hours after Ski had gotten the call from his boss, Ski was still at Sandy's townhouse. He was out on the driveway, making sure they hadn't missed any tire tracks or any other evidence out there, and as he did that, he looked up and saw the sun rising, and that was when he realized how tired he was. But just then, a Toyota 4Runner vehicle pulled up in front of the townhouse, and a man stepped out of the car and started walking towards Ski, and Ski immediately felt a jolt of energy. The man introduced himself as Tony Ponycall, the victim's boyfriend. He was now wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, and he said he'd spoken to officers at the hospital and they had let him go. And so he wanted to come back home to see if he could help the police who were there. Ski was shocked at how calm Tony seemed. His girlfriend had just been shot and killed, and he showed up at the scene of the crime like he was there to just help them find a missing dog or something. But Ski knew shock affected people differently, so he didn't want to jump to conclusions. Ski asked Tony if they could go inside and talk through the events of the previous evening. Tony smiled and said he'd be happy to help. And as they walked across the yard towards the front door, Ski noticed there were scratches on Tony's hands and arms. Once they were inside, Tony led Ski through a foyer with peach-colored tile floors and into a living room with a high ceiling. Tony sat down on the couch, and Ski sat in a chair across from him. Police had found no evidence of forced entry in the house, and Tony said nobody other than him had come into the house that night. Then, with an almost blank look on his face, Tony said he'd been in the upstairs bedroom when he heard something going on in the garage, so he went downstairs to see if maybe Sandy had gotten home, and he told Ski about how he had found Sandy slumped over in her car. But even when talking about the moment he had found Sandy with blood all over her face and clothes and all over the car, Tony remained completely calm. So, Ski leaned in a bit closer and asked Tony if he and Sandy's relationship was serious or more like casual dating. And Tony said Sandy was actually his fiancée. A confused look came across Ski's face, and he pointed out that Tony had just introduced himself as Sandy's boyfriend. But Tony quickly said that he just hadn't gotten used to being engaged yet. Ski nodded, but watched Tony's face closely to see if he looked like he might be lying, but Tony's appearance never changed. So, Ski pointed at Tony's hands and arms and asked him how he'd gotten all those cuts. Tony said when he climbed into the car to try to revive Sandy, he'd cut his arms and his hands on the shattered glass. And he also said he had not been wearing shoes or socks at the time, and he'd cut his bare feet as well on the glass on the ground. And when he said this, Ski figured that probably cleared up who those bloody footprints belonged to. Then finally, Ski looked Tony in the eye and asked him if he could think of anyone who might want to harm or kill Sandy. And for the first time, Tony's calm, cool demeanor disappeared. His face started to turn red, he clenched his jaw, and then he said there was one person who definitely could have killed Sandy. And that guy was a guy they called Mr. Clean, Tracy Humphrey. In his time as a detective, Ski had tried to stick to a simple rule: never get tunnel vision when working a case. Over the years, he'd seen a lot of cops build cases entirely around one suspect, and when that suspect turned out to be innocent, the cases just fell apart. So, in the days following Sandy's murder, Ski still definitely considered Tony to be a major suspect. Tony was the one who had found Sandy and called 911, and he had those scratches on his hands and arms. And on the day after the murder, Ski had heard from one of Sandy's coworkers at the Green Iguana that Sandy had never agreed to marry Tony, and she'd actually told him she didn't want a serious relationship with him at all. So Tony calling Sandy his fiancée just seemed totally strange to Ski. But Tony had undergone a gunpowder residue test to determine if he'd recently fired a gun, he had willingly submitted DNA samples, and he had allowed the forensics team to do a thorough investigation of his car. And so, while the investigators waited for all those test results to come back, Ski started looking into other possible suspects. And someone who worked at the Green Iguana had seen a bearded man kind of lurking outside the night Sandy was killed, but they had no idea who he was. So Ski now had Tony and this unknown bearded guy as possible suspects, but for the time, he wanted to turn his attention to Tracy Humphrey, aka Mr. Clean, the man who Tony was so sure could be Sandy's killer. So at 3 p.m. on July 8th, less than 3 days after Sandy's murder, Ski paid a visit to the gym where Tracy worked as an instructor and personal trainer. Ski walked into the gym and heard the sound of trainers shouting encouragement and people grunting while they lifted weights. Then he walked up to the front desk, showed the man behind the counter his badge, and asked to speak with Tracy. The employee said he would go get Tracy and pointed Ski to a small office where he could have some privacy. Ski thanked the man and then walked into the office, took a seat at a table with nothing on it, and waited. And a couple of minutes later, Tracy walked in. He was 36 years old, out of breath, dripping with sweat, and had a towel wrapped around his neck. Ski was taken aback by how big and intimidating this guy was. Ski asked Tracy to close the door behind him and have a seat. So Tracy closed the door, he wiped the sweat from his face with his towel, and then he sat down. Then he introduced himself to Ski in a low, soft voice. And right away, Ski thought that Tracy's voice didn't really match his body. Ski smiled and said he knew Tracy was working, so he wouldn't take up much of his time. Then he asked if Tracy had heard about what happened to his friend Sandy. Tracy said he'd read about it in the newspaper and that he was totally heartbroken. Ski told Tracy that he was very sorry for his loss because Ski believed that it was always a good idea to start a line of questioning by empathizing. But before Ski could actually ask a follow-up question, Tracy suddenly stood up and said he did not feel comfortable talking to police at work, and that if Ski had a problem with that, he could contact Tracy's lawyer. Ski was surprised the conversation had taken such a quick turn, and it definitely made him question why Tracy wanted to get out of there so fast. But he didn't have anything to charge Tracy with, so he just thanked Tracy for his time, stepped out of the office, and walked back through the gym. And when Ski stepped outside, right away he felt the sun on his face and a warm breeze blowing. The temperature was about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and Ski thought that this was the perfect kind of summer day to go to the beach. And right there, it struck him that Sandy would never get to enjoy these perfect summer days in Florida ever again because someone had robbed her of her future. And that made Ski very angry. He wanted to find Sandy's killer as fast as he could. And the conversation he just had inside the gym made him want to dig a lot deeper into Tracy's life. Over the following week, Ski and the investigative team returned to Sandy's townhouse multiple times to see if any new evidence had emerged. And they also followed up with Sandy's coworkers to see if they remembered something from the night of Sandy's murder that they might have overlooked the first time they were interviewed. But nothing new surfaced. So during that time, Ski also did something that some other detectives might not have done. Ski's father had been a fireman, and so Ski had always admired firefighters and had close relationships with a lot of them in the area. And so he reached out to friends at different local fire departments, filled them in on the Sandy Rozzo case, and asked them to please let him know if they had anything that might help him find Sandy's killer and bring them to justice. Ski didn't know if anything would come of asking these firemen for help, but it just made sense to him to use all the resources at his disposal. But as the days passed, no new evidence came in from anywhere, and so Ski started to really get frustrated. And he wanted to move the investigation forward, but he'd run into a big problem. Tracy's lawyer had told Tracy not to say another word to police about Sandy's murder. And that was a major roadblock for Ski, because even if Tracy hadn't killed Sandy, the police couldn't rule him out if they didn't get any information from him. But Ski refused to let this lawyer bring his investigation to a stop, so he came up with a plan to work around Tracy. Ski had learned that Tracy recently married a 20-year-old woman named Ashley who worked with him at the gym. So he figured if he couldn't talk to Tracy, maybe he could talk to Tracy's new wife. But Ski wanted to make sure Ashley was alone when he met with her, because if Tracy was there, Ashley almost certainly would be told not to talk. So at around 3 p.m. on July 16th, 11 days after Sandy's murder, Ski drove to the gym where Tracy and Ashley worked and parked right outside. Then he stepped out of his car and walked right up to the large windows out front and pressed his face up to the glass to look inside. But he couldn't see if Tracy or Ashley were in the gym or not. So Ski went inside, walked up to the employee he'd met there the last time, and asked if Tracy was working. The man said he was, but that he just started teaching a class. So Ski asked if Ashley was working, and the man said no, she had the day off. And that was all Ski needed to hear. He turned around, rushed out of the gym, and ran to his car. He knew he was in a race now. As soon as Tracy finished his class and found out a cop had been looking for him and Ashley, Tracy would call his wife to tell her not to talk. So Ski got in his car, started the engine, peeled out, and sped off down the street. And about 10 minutes later, after speeding across town, Ski hit the brakes and parked his car in front of the apartment building where Tracy and Ashley lived. He took a deep breath, calmed himself down, and then got out of the car and walked to their apartment. After knocking on the door opened, and it was Ashley. Ashley was pretty with long brown curly hair and big eyes, and she was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. Ski showed her his badge and asked if he could come inside and talk for a bit. Ashley shifted back and forth on her feet, and she had a nervous look on her face, but she said okay. Ashley closed the door behind them and then led Ski to their living room. Ashley walked around a wooden coffee table and sat down on the couch, and Ski took a seat in a nearby chair. Once they were seated, Ski asked her how long she'd been married to Tracy, and Ashley said they'd actually just gotten married on July 4th at the gym where they worked. Ski smiled and said it must have been nice to have a wedding on a holiday with fireworks going off all night. Then Ski asked her if she and her new husband had gone on a honeymoon right after their wedding. But Ashley laughed and said the following night, July 5th, they just rented some movies, ordered pizza, and just hung out on the couch. Ashley shifted her position on the couch and asked what this was all about. But Ski just kept on smiling and asked where they had rented the movies and gotten pizza from. And Ashley gave him the name of the video store and the pizza place. Then Ashley's cell phone, which was sitting on the coffee table, started to ring. She sat up straight and looked at the phone and then asked Ski if she could answer it, and Ski said, of course, it was her phone. So Ashley grabbed the phone, walked into the kitchen, and answered the call. And when Ski heard her talking from the other room, he knew it was Tracy on the other line and that getting any more information out of Ashley was going to be impossible. But Ski kept on smiling because he'd gotten what he'd came for. Ashley had just given Tracy an alibi for the night of the murder, and now Ski just had to follow up on it. So, after Ashley hung up and came back into the living room, Ski immediately just thanked her for her help and then walked outside to his car. And not long after that, he drove to the video store that Ashley had mentioned, and an employee there pulled up Tracy's rental history and showed Ski that Tracy had indeed rented movies a few hours before Sandy had been murdered. After that, Ski drove to the pizza place that Ashley said they'd ordered from, and one of the pizza delivery drivers there pulled up their records on their computer, and the records showed that Tracy had ordered pizza less than an hour before Sandy's murder. And then the delivery driver told Ski that he remembered delivering that pizza to a tall, big, bald guy a little after 11 p.m. on July 5th, almost the exact time Sandy had been killed. Ski thanked the pizza delivery guy and then went back outside, got into his car, and headed for the police station. And as he drove, he felt like even though this was great information, it was like he had hit a big dead end. Tracy's simple alibi, that he was at home eating pizza, looked like it was the truth. And so Ski wondered if maybe he needed to take his focus off of Tracy for a while and turn it back to Sandy's roommate, Tony. But then, on the following day, Ski got a call from one of the people he'd spoken to at the Tampa Fire Department, and they said they'd found something in an arson case of theirs that they thought might be connected to Sandy's murder. And what the fire department told Ski would put his investigation right back on track, and it would lead him directly to the bearded man who had tried to shoot Sandy in the Green Iguana parking lot. Based on the report that Ski received from the fire department, evidence found at the crime scene, and information gathered throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Sandy on July 5th, 2003. A little after 10:30 p.m. on July 5th, Sandy's killer had fallen asleep in a compact rental car in the Green Iguana parking lot. The killer was wearing a baseball cap pulled down low just above their eyes, and the thick sweatshirt and pants they were wearing had caused them to get so hot inside of the car that they dozed off for a few minutes. But then, the sound of a car door slamming nearby had woken them up. They looked out the windshield and saw Sandy driving off in her black BMW. The killer immediately sat up straight and yelled out in frustration, and then slammed their hands down on the steering wheel. The killer had intended to shoot Sandy right there in the parking lot, but now that wasn't an option. So the killer glanced over and looked at their Ruger .22 caliber pistol on the passenger seat, and then they started the car and pulled out onto the street behind Sandy's BMW. The killer still felt a little out of it from having fallen asleep, and their hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, but they managed to weave their way through holiday weekend traffic and keep up with Sandy's car. Then, after about 25 minutes, the killer followed Sandy as she turned off a main road into her neighborhood. The killer eased off the gas to make sure they didn't get too close to Sandy's car. The killer saw Sandy pull into her driveway, open the garage door, and park her BMW inside of the garage. So the killer pulled the rental car right up to the curb in front of Sandy's townhouse. Then, with their heart pounding in anticipation, the killer wiped the sweat from their eyes, they grabbed the pistol off the passenger seat, opened the car door, and ran up the driveway into the garage. Once the killer was inside, they saw Sandy leaning over the passenger seat to grab her purse. So the killer ran up to the driver's side, raised the pistol, and slammed the butt of it into the window and held their hand up to shield their eyes from the glass. But they didn't break the window. Instead, the killer looked down and saw the glass intact, and inside the vehicle, Sandy had heard the sound, whipped herself around, and was looking up at them with a look of fear and confusion on her face. Then Sandy began screaming and she raised her foot and began kicking the driver's side door over and over again, trying to open it to maybe slam into the killer. But the door didn't open and Sandy just kept on kicking. Meanwhile, the killer could feel every muscle in their body start to tense up, and more sweat dripped down their face and neck, and their chests started to feel tight, and in a panic, the killer just raised their gun right up to the window and fired into the car. The window shattered and glass flew at the killer, but they kept on firing over and over again until they had unloaded all 8 rounds into the car. Inside the BMW, Sandy was bleeding from her torso, her foot, her head. Blood covered her face and clothes and was spattered on the car seats and floorboards. She was choking, her vision was fading, and she was struggling to breathe. Then everything went black, and Sandy slumped over the center console. After looking inside the car and making sure Sandy was motionless, the killer turned and ran out of the garage, back down the driveway, got into their rental car, and once inside, they took a deep breath and put the pistol back on the passenger seat, right next to the fake beard they had been wearing earlier that night. It would turn out the short, bearded man who had failed to kill Sandy in May when they had fired at her coming out of the bar and missed, and then had successfully killed Sandy on July 5th, was really a woman in disguise. It was Ashley Humphrey, Tracy's new wife. And on both occasions, Ashley had disguised herself as a man by wearing baggy jeans, a big sweatshirt, a baseball cap pulled down low, and a cheap fake beard. And she had made a point to be seen looking like a man by other people outside the Green Iguana, which is why she was kind of lurking around. She wanted to be seen. But on the night of the actual murder, Ashley, who had been wearing the beard, had been sweating so much that she had removed it when she'd actually gone inside the garage to kill Sandy. And it was the call from the Tampa Fire Department that actually led Ski back to Ashley almost right after he had thought about moving on from her and her husband. On the night of Ashley's failed murder attempt on Sandy back in May, she had accidentally shot her own car's side mirror, and Ashley had worried that the bullet hole in her mirror would eventually attract police attention. So, in a total panic, Ashley had driven her Volkswagen Beetle with the shot-up side view mirror to a vacant lot and then set it on fire. And when the fire department investigated what they believed was a case of arson, they had traced the burned Volkswagen back to Ashley. And then, when they had talked to Ski about this, they realized that Ashley was in a relationship with Tracy Humphrey, who was one of Ski's major suspects. And so, Ashley was ultimately arrested, and she confessed to killing Sandy. But the case didn't end there. Leading up to Ashley's trial, she cooperated with police, and she said Tracy had threatened her with violence in order to force her to murder Sandy. And she said Tracy had even made her marry him the night before the murder because spouses cannot be forced to testify against each other in court. And it would turn out that Tracy had a clear motive for wanting to kill Sandy, because the fight he had had with Sandy when she refused to have sex with him had actually been far worse than most of Sandy's friends knew. On that night, after Tracy had flown into a rage, he had beaten Sandy and raped her. And eventually, Sandy had filed charges against Tracy, and his trial was set to start in August of 2003. So he had gotten Ashley to kill Sandy so the state wouldn't have a witness to prove the allegations against him, and the trial would just go away. Despite Tony Ponycall's odd decision to call Sandy his girlfriend and then also his fiancée when talking to police, along with his weirdly calm behavior in the immediate aftermath of Sandy's murder, he was not actually in any way connected to her death. Ashley was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison and is scheduled for release in 2028. As for Tracy, in the lead-up to his murder trial, several women stepped forward and shared their own stories about how he had also abused them. Tracy was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Located on the far northern tip of Maine, right on the border of Canada, lies a small rural town called Van Buren. Van Buren is home to about 2,000 people who, for the most part, have lived in Maine for their entire lives, and they tend to be very rugged and very competent people. But unless you live in Van Buren or know someone in Van Buren or have family out there, there's no reason you would have heard of this particular town. Nothing really happens in this town, at least nothing that makes headlines. However, that would change. In 2019, Van Buren made international headlines because of one man, Ronald Sear. As a young man in the 1950s, Ronald Sear joined the Air Force and fought in the Korean War. And then after he got out of the military, he moved back to his hometown of Van Buren, Maine, and he moved into a very modest 2-story home right near town. And for a little while, he just kind of floated about, didn't really have a direction in life. But eventually, because of his love for working with his hands and his general skill at working with his hands and building things, he started a small but successful tool-selling company that he ran right out of his shed on his property. Fast forward to 2019, Ronald Sear at that time was 65 years old, and he still lived in the same property right near town in Van Buren. However, he now lived alone, and he still ran this tool-selling business right out of his work shed. And for Ronald, this was enough. He was very content with his life. He was very happy. But that year, he would face a crisis. One bright, sunny morning in the summer of that year, Ronald left his house and he walked over to his shed. He went inside, and right away he noticed something. Ronald kept all these bins inside of his shed that were full of all of the different tools that he would sell. And because he was in there all the time, either literally selling tools or tinkering with whatever it was he was building himself, he was very aware of how full each of these bins were. And anytime they got low, he would order more so he had enough supply to sell. And so he went into his shed this morning and he noticed right away that a couple of the bins appeared to be a little bit lower than he remembered. And right away, Ronald is thinking, did I forget to order supplies to fill these bins up? Did I just forget to do that? But he's thinking to himself, I am meticulous in making sure my inventory is full at all times. I've been doing this for decades, and so it can't be me. Maybe I took the tools and I brought them into my house and I've left them in there, or maybe they're in my truck. And so Ronald, believing there's a totally logical explanation for this, would leave his shed and he would search his property, but he can't find these tools anywhere. And so he began calling his family and his friends to see if, maybe they had come by and borrowed some of these tools, or maybe they knew what had happened to them. But everyone he spoke to said, no, I have no idea. And so by that afternoon, Ronald had found himself back inside of his work shed looking around, thinking to himself, have I been robbed? It was the only logical thing he could think of that would explain this loss. And so Ronald drove to the police station and he spoke to police and he explained what happened. But unfortunately, the police's reaction to what he was telling them was not exactly what he wanted. They basically assumed that, he just had miscounted, that in reality, the tools were either still in the shed and he just forgot how many were supposed to be in there, or he had just kind of lost them on his property somewhere, that they were bound to turn up. And so the police told him, look, Ronald, go back and search your property. I'm sure they're there. And if you get some proof that someone actually stole from you, then come back to us. And so Ronald was really annoyed by this. He wanted them to take this seriously, but he could tell they just were not going to. And so Ronald drove back to his house, he went inside, he hopped on his computer, and he began researching what other homeowners did to protect themselves from things like theft. And one of the things he came across was setting up tripwires all around the perimeter of your property. Basically, you take these thin wires and you stretch them out very tight, very low to the ground, and you anchor them on each side, and then on the wire itself, you hang little bells. And so, in theory, if an intruder were to walk onto your property, they would most likely not see the tripwires on the ground, and they would kick them, and that would cause the bells to ring, thereby alerting the homeowner of their presence. Ronald loved this idea, so he went out and he set up tripwires all around his property. But over the next several days after these wires were stood up, none of the wires made any sound, and still more tools continued to go missing. This was also in spite of the fact that his shed was locked at night. And so Ronald's thinking to himself, whoever's doing this is clearly watching me and kind of monitoring what I'm doing. They must be aware of the tripwires, and they must be sneaking into the shed, at some time that I have the doors unlocked. I mean, this is a professional thief. And so as Ronald is thinking about this master thief that is targeting him, he has this sudden fear that if he can't stop this person from breaking into his shed and taking his tools, how can he possibly protect himself against this person breaking into his home and stealing things from in there, which included all of his cash and many other valuables? And so Ronald became very fearful and decided the only thing he could do was really beef up his home security system. And so he hopped back online and he began Googling other ways to protect your property. And after discovering a number of really effective techniques, he got to work. He began building all these home defense systems and placing them all around his property. And after all of these kind of DIY security measures were put up, the theft of his tools stopped. And in Ronald's mind, that validated that his defense system had worked. He was effectively preventing theft. But this would not be the end of his troubles. Fast forward to Thanksgiving that year, so November 28th, and the Van Buren police got a very frantic phone call from Ronald. He was totally hysterical, he wasn't really making sense, and the police, they tried to understand what was going on, but all they could get from Ronald was that he was requesting police to come to his residence immediately. And so the police, they hang up and they're thinking, okay, we know Ronald was dealing with a potential thief. Maybe he literally caught the thief red-handed and he wants us to come and arrest this person, and who knows, maybe they're fighting at his residence right now. And so the police speed over to Ronald's house, they pull into his driveway, and at first glance, nothing looks out of the ordinary. Ronald's truck is in the driveway, and there's no obvious signs of a disturbance, but they notice the front door to Ronald's house is wide open. And so the police park their cars in Ronald's driveway, they get out and they run up onto the front porch, and they're standing in front of this open door, and they look down and they can see there's a very obvious blood trail starting from the front of Ronald's house, going straight back down a hallway that looped around to the left and out of sight. And so right away, the police are yelling into the house, Ronald, are you okay? What's going on? And somewhere deep inside of the house, they hear what sounds like Ronald make a kind of guttural sound. And so immediately this tips the police that more than likely Ronald has been hurt, and he likely is the one who made this blood trail. And so the police draw their guns and they go inside of Ronald's house, not really sure what they're going to find. They don't know if there's some intruder or attacker or someone in here that's harmed Ronald, but they make their way down this hall following the blood trail. They turn the corner, and then sitting at the end of the blood trail is Ronald. He's sitting down with his back to some cabinets in the kitchen, and he's clutching his midsection. He is covered in blood. He's completely pale. And so right away, the officers call in backup, but then as a security measure, they search the rest of the first floor to make sure there is no other person here. There was no one on the first floor. They went to the second floor. They peeked around up there. They didn't see anyone. So they rushed back down to Ronald, who's still just sitting there, and they begin administering first aid, and they're trying to get him to explain what happened. How did you get hurt? But Ronald is clearly in shock. He's kind of in a daze. He's not making sense. And then by the time the paramedics showed up just a couple of minutes later, Ronald had slipped into unconsciousness. When Ronald was wheeled out of the house, the responding officers and the backup officers, who by now had arrived, decided to search the rest of Ronald's house to see if there was some clue as to what had happened. And so they began searching in the kitchen, looking around, but there wasn't anything that stood out to them. And then they began walking around towards the living room. And when they got into the living room, one of the officers suddenly screamed to everyone inside to stop where they were, stop moving. It would turn out Ronald, as part of his very beefed up home security system, had installed various booby traps all around his property, including inside of his house. And some of these traps were gun booby traps. The officer that had yelled for everyone to stop had spotted one of these traps. He saw a handgun anchored to the ceiling aimed at the front door, and there was a string attached to the trigger that was also then attached to the doorknob of the front door. And so if this trap were live and some person opened the front door, it would activate this trap, causing the gun to shoot them. And so clearly, Ronald had accidentally left this particular booby trap on, and he had accidentally activated it, shooting himself. And so after the officer sees this gun anchored to the ceiling, he tells everyone, and they begin looking up and just looking around to see if there are other traps. And amazingly, there are. In other doorways, just from where they're standing, they can see the barrels of guns pointing down that are obvious booby traps. In their haste to get in there and figure out what was going on, they hadn't noticed all of these guns in the ceiling, and so it was just kind of a miracle that none of the other traps had been set off. Ronald would be rushed to the hospital that night, but he would pass away from his wound. His death would be ruled an accident, and to this day, we don't know if he really was dealing with a professional thief that was stealing his tools, or if it was just a figment of his imagination. Our next story is called Sublimation. In early 2020, a very popular Russian Instagram influencer named Ekterina Didenko was getting ready to celebrate her 29th birthday. She, along with her husband and some of her influencer friends, were planning to enjoy the occasion at a popular spa in Moscow, Russia. The group rented out a private section of the spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. And then once the reservations were made, Didenko and all of her influencer friends began eagerly talking about how excited they were about this party on their various social media accounts. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, Didenko, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited, they all descended on this spa. So they go inside, they go back to their private area, and it's great. There's food, there's alcohol, there's music. They're jumping into the pool, then getting in the hot tub, and everyone's just having a great time. Everyone's taking pictures and filming and live streaming. I mean, it's really going as well as it possibly could be. And then at some point, Didenko's husband signals the rest of the group, minus Didenko, and they all begin to pull out these white hazardous materials suits. Imagine what you would see in a movie if there was some huge chemical leak, a full body white suit with a mask. And so they're all putting on these hazmat suits, and they give one to Didenko, who puts it on as well, and they tell her this is part of her big surprise. Now, it's unclear if Didenko actually didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she's just pretending to be surprised because it would do better on social media, because this is all being filmed and she's an influencer. But either way, she puts on her hazmat suit, and once everyone has their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in this huge cooler like you would bring to a picnic, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. When he opened the lid, the crowd all gasped and laughed and smiled and filmed as these huge clouds of smoke or steam came pouring out of it. What it was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice is just frozen carbon dioxide. It's commonly used for things like refrigerating perishable goods for long periods of time because dry ice stays cold for a really long time. Also, because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of dry ice, it's also very commonly used as a sort of spooky decoration because you have these very cool white clouds going everywhere. And in fact, that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool and create those big white gas clouds all over the pool. The reason they call it dry ice is because as it starts to heat up, it doesn't melt into a liquid state the way frozen water does. Instead, it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous if it's handled inappropriately, and while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. It's far more likely they were wearing them because it would look good on social media and would kind of hype up the stunt they were about to do. And so after the dry ice was revealed inside of this cooler, Didenko's husband and another of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its contents directly into the water. And as soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive, almost explosion of carbon dioxide gas to completely fill the lower half of the room. Now, none of the partygoers are even a little bit fazed by what's happening. They don't realize how dangerous this actually is. And so they're just filming and laughing and kind of thinking this is so funny. And then Didenko's husband actually leaps through the cloud into the water and kind of disappears below. And then shortly after that, 2 other partygoers would also leap into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous if handled inappropriately is because dry ice emits that carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. So imagine if you're in a very small room that has very poor ventilation. If you had lots of carbon dioxide in there, you would suffocate. And so this indoor pool was a small confined space with poor ventilation. And so the 7 people on the pool deck, shortly after this dry ice has been tossed into the pool, they started to realize it was really hard to breathe because the oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. And so they were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck before it was too late. Meanwhile, Didenko's husband and the other 2 people who leapt into the pool, when they came back to the surface, they breathed in thinking they would be breathing in oxygen, but instead they breathed in an entire lungful of carbon dioxide, which, in addition to displacing oxygen at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation, it is also poisonous at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation. And so when the three of them surfaced, they breathed in this poisonous gas, which caused two of them to immediately pass out and then just die. While the third, Didenko's husband, he managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to climb barely out of the pool, and he tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die, not only from carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from having gone without oxygen for as long as he had. The next and final story of today's episode is called Woodworking Project. At the end of 2002, 36-year-old Boyd Taylor was single, he had no children, and he lived with his divorced father, Robert, in a small bungalow in the northern England countryside. In addition to living with his father, Boyd also worked for his father. His father, Robert, owned a small construction business, and so the father-son duo built houses in the area. While Boyd might have envisioned his life turning out in a different, more exciting way, he didn't seem outwardly unhappy about his circumstances. In fact, he seemed very cheerful, both at work and when he was at home. But despite his cheerfulness, his father, Robert, was still pretty concerned about him, because every time Boyd had some time off from work and was just at loose ends, he wouldn't go out with his friends. In fact, he really didn't have any friends and wasn't even trying to make any friends. Instead, he would just sit in his room all day and be totally by himself. Now, Robert knew his son was naturally a bit of a loner and always had been, but a part of him hoped that his son would just start going out and meeting new people, or at the very least, develop some sort of hobby that could occupy his mind. In late September of 2002, Robert was walking down the hallway of their bungalow when he passed by his son's bedroom door, and it was shut. And as he walked past, he heard inside of his son's room the sound of his son sawing some wood. And so he stopped for a second and he just listened. And when the sawing stopped for a second, Robert just knocked on the door. He was curious. He wanted to know what his son was doing. Boyd, instead of coming over to the door and opening it up and talking to his dad, instead just paused for a second and then said, "What is it, Dad? What do you need?" And Robert would say, "Well, I heard sawing and I just wanted to know what you were building." And so Boyd pauses again and then just says, "Well, I'm working on a woodworking project." And so Robert's like, "Well, can I poke my head in and actually see what you're building?" And Boyd, again, without opening the door, just tells his dad very politely that he wants to be left alone. And so Robert decides not to push the issue. Whatever he was doing, it was his business. And so he just told his son that, hey, if you need any help with anything, let me know. I'd be glad to help. And then Robert walked away. Over the next 2 months, every time Boyd was not working, so in the evenings and on the weekend, he would be locked inside of his bedroom, hammering and sawing away at this woodworking project. And over those 2 months, Robert would periodically walk down the hall and stand in front of his son's bedroom and knock on the door and try to get his son to let him in to just see what he was up to, not only because he just wanted to see what his son was doing, but because Robert was a carpenter by trade and so was just genuinely interested. But every time he asked to be let in, Boyd would very politely tell his father that he really just wants to be left alone, and Robert respected his wishes. In early December, Boyd approached his father and said, "Hey, would it be possible for me to take the next month off from work so I can focus on this woodworking project?" Now, for Robert, this was a massive inconvenience. This construction business that he owned was really just he and his son building the houses. And so if his son was not going to be working, then Robert would be solo on all of his projects for that month. But Robert's thinking to himself, my son has finally found a hobby that he's really into. I don't really know what it is, but clearly he's invested in it. And so he tells his son, "You know what? That's fine. You take the whole month. And if you want more time in January, that's fine. You just let me know." So starting that first week in December, every time Robert would leave the house to go to work in the morning, he would leave to the sound of Boyd in his bedroom hammering and sawing and tinkering away at his woodworking project. And then several hours later, when Robert finally came back home, he'd walk into the house and the first thing he would hear is his son still in his bedroom, still hammering and sawing away. When December finally ended and Robert expected his son to be done with his project and to finally show him what he's been working on, Boyd approached him and said, "Well, Dad, I'm not quite done with the project. I need about 2 more weeks." And so Robert said, "No problem, we'll talk in 2 weeks." So December rolled into January and Boyd just continued to work all day long inside of his bedroom. Then on the evening of January 7th, Robert was home. He was watching TV in the living room and Boyd was hard at work in his bedroom right down the hall when Robert decided he was tired and he was going to go to bed. So he stands up, turns the TV off, he leaves the living room, he goes down the hallway with his son's room on the right, and as he passed, he can hear his son at work, and he kind of yells to his son that he's going to bed, and then Robert goes into his bedroom, crawls into his bed, and falls asleep. At 3:30 a.m. the following morning, Robert is suddenly awoken by this incredibly loud crashing sound somewhere in his house. Robert's first thought was the chimney must have collapsed. That was how loud the sound was. And so he leaps out of his bed, he runs out of his door, he goes down the hallway past his son's room into the living room, and he looks at the fireplace, which is in the TV room, and clearly the chimney has not collapsed onto itself. And so he's standing there thinking, what else could that sound have been? And then he's thinking to himself, well, did I really hear that sound, or was that sound in my dream? And I kind of thought it was real, but it really wasn't. And so just to be sure, he walked all around the house, kind of seeing if there were any signs of something big falling and crashing on the ground, but the house seemed totally in order. And so he walked back down the hallway towards his bedroom, and he stopped right outside of his son's room, and he considered knocking and waking his son up to see if maybe he had heard this loud sound too. But when he listened to the door, it was quiet inside, so he figured, what, my son's asleep, I'm not going to wake him up for this. And so Robert just went into his bedroom and he went back to sleep. A few hours later, Robert got up and he left his bedroom, he went into the kitchen and he made himself some food. And as he's preparing his food, he's realizing that he doesn't hear the sound of Boyd working in his bedroom, because normally Boyd would be working that early in the morning, but he wasn't. And so right before Robert left to go to work that day, he actually walked down the hall and listened to his son's bedroom to hear if maybe he was at work in there, but he just hadn't heard him. But it was totally silent in the room. And so he reached down to the doorknob, thinking maybe he could just poke his head in and see if his son was on his bed. But when he tried the doorknob, it was locked. So Robert just thought to himself, okay, I guess Boyd is sleeping in this morning, and so I'm not going to bother him. And so Robert leaves the house, he gets into his truck and he drives off to work. And then several hours later, he comes back to the house at night and he walks inside, and the first thing he hears is nothing. It's silent. And this house in the evenings for the past several months was never quiet. Boyd was always hammering, sawing, and tinkering away at this woodworking project. And so right away, Robert's thinking to himself, maybe he's done with the project and I can finally see this thing he's been working on. And so Robert drops his stuff at the door and he walks down the hallway. He goes to his son's bedroom door and he knocks and he says, "Hey, Boyd, are you done with your project?" But he's met with silence. And so Robert reaches down again and tries the doorknob, but it's locked. And so Robert's standing there thinking, it's too early for him to be asleep. And so he yells out for Boyd, "Hey, what's going on? Where are you? I haven't seen you today. Come out here. Come talk to me." But again, it's silent. And so Robert's thinking, okay, well, when I pulled in, was his car in the driveway? And he can't remember. And so he leaves the house, he goes out to the driveway, and sure enough, there's Boyd's car. It's in the driveway, so he has to be here. And so suddenly Robert's starting to feel a little bit panicked about his son. He runs back into the house and he just starts screaming his son's name as he goes room to room into the bathrooms and the other bedrooms to see if he's in there, but he's nowhere to be found. And so operating on a gut instinct, Robert just runs right out to his car. He gets a sledgehammer, comes back in the house, goes down the hallway, and he's standing in front of his son's bedroom door. And one more time, he yells for his son and bangs on the door, tries to get his son's attention. But after once again there being total silence, he picks up his sledgehammer and begins breaking the door down. And after a couple of swings, he manages to pop off the locking mechanism, the actual doorknob. That gets blown off and he can push the door open and he sees inside the bedroom is empty. There's just a bed and a dresser and there's no Boyd. But in the back right corner of the room, where normally there was like this alcove, basically a segment of his room kind of jutted away from the rest of the space, almost like it was a closet, but with no door on it, Boyd had clearly built a wall and door over that alcove, kind of creating a sort of sub-room within his bedroom. And this door was shut. And so Robert immediately runs over to this new second door. He tries the doorknob, it's locked. He yells for his son, but again, after silence, he picks the sledge up and begins trying to break this door down. And after a few good swings, like the first door, he was able to knock the doorknob off of the door, and then he reached down and he pulled the door open. And what he saw on the other side of this door, inside of this little subroom, was so far from anything he ever expected that he just stood there in stunned silence. And then eventually reality kind of kicked back in, and he ran out of his son's room and he called the police. 3 months earlier, Boyd had decided he wanted to build this very specific device that was invented in 1789. Now, he didn't want his father to know about this device, and so he built that door and wall frame in front of that alcove specifically so he could build this device inside of this new subroom in privacy. He also always made sure to lock his main bedroom door. So for 3 months, Boyd began constructing this 8-foot tall, 3-foot wide structure inside of the subroom. And once the shell of this device was constructed, he began installing all of its inner workings. These included things like various lengths of wire and clock timers and a jigsaw, which is like an electric saw. And then finally, on January 7th, it was complete. So that night, Boyd blew up an air mattress and he slid it inside of the subroom right underneath this ancient machine he had built. And then after that, he went and locked the main bedroom door. He went into the subroom himself and shut the subroom door and locked that. And then he pulled 12 sleeping pills out of his pocket, swallowed those, and then laid down on this air mattress on his back, looking up at the inner workings of this machine. And then once he was positioned the way he wanted to, he reached over up inside of this machine and he felt around for a button that he had placed. He pressed that button and then he put his hands over his chest and he laid there looking straight up until the sleeping pills kicked in and he fell asleep. That button he pressed right before he passed out from the sleeping pills started a timer, and when that timer went off, it would actually activate this whole device. And so several hours after pressing that button, the timer finally went off at 3:30 a.m. The first thing that happened when this device was activated is the jigsaw, the electric saw, began sawing this wire. Now, the wire had been very intentionally placed against the teeth of this jigsaw, and so it's cutting this wire, and this wire is supporting this weighted down, heavy, angular blade that's pointing straight down. And so as soon as this wire is cut, it releases the blade, and the blade that almost looks like this oversized axe head begins falling straight down this chute, and the chute aims the blade directly onto the front of Boyd's throat. Boyd's woodworking project was a guillotine, and that loud crashing sound that woke Robert up at 3:30 in the morning on January 8th, that was the sound of the blade of this guillotine crashing down and decapitating his son. Even though Boyd did not leave behind a note explaining his actions, it was determined Boyd's death was in fact a suicide, a very complicated and deliberate suicide. Boyd's father and other people involved in this case have come to the conclusion that Boyd was clearly showing signs of depression before he chose to take his own life. And so maybe if Boyd had reached out for help or if there had been some sort of intervention, his death could have been prevented. And if you or anyone you know is struggling with mental health, remember you are not alone. No matter how bad it feels, there are resources out there that can help you. And so I've listed a number of them in the description below. 2013, a young woman named Melissa finally moved out of her mother's house and got her own place across town. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call, she'd answer, and she could hear them breathing, but they weren't saying anything. And then she started getting these huge bouquets of flowers delivered to her front step, but they were delivered from anonymous. Then after that, she started noticing things in her kitchen and her living room were going missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks and knives, little things, but since she lived alone and she was the only one moving these things, they really stood out. Melissa had this habit that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had this irrational fear if she didn't do that, that it would spark a fire and her house would burn down in the middle of the night. So she was pretty obsessive compulsive about always making sure the TV was unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night, around the same time she's getting these hang-up calls and there's flowers being sent to her door and things are going missing, she unplugs her TV and she goes up to bed. The next morning, she gets up and comes downstairs and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself that, well, she must have forgot to unplug the TV. As rare of an event as that is, it has to be what happened. And so that night, she unplugs the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug, confirming that, yes, I've unplugged the TV. And then she puts it down and looks again at the outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely not plugged in. And then she goes upstairs to bed. The next morning when she walks downstairs, she had the sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because her TV was right at the bottom of the stairs, that when she turned the corner, it would be plugged in again and her worst nightmare would come true, that something is happening on my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs and turns the corner, what does she see? The TV is plugged in again. She's horrified, but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious act. And she's telling herself, well, maybe I forgot again, but then she's like, no, I remember last night staring at the plug. I definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, one, everything is locked, but two, no one else is in here. And when she's satisfied that, yup, it's empty down here, and two, everything is locked, she sits there thinking, well, now what do I do? Do I call the police and say, someone's plugging in my TV? You know, she can't do anything. And it was at this point that Melissa developed a very real fear of her first floor. And she began going to bed so early at night because she could not be on that floor when it started to get dark. And so imagine living alone, being afraid of going down to your first floor, how scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're going to attribute to your first floor. And so Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3 o'clock. The sun's not even down yet, but she's upstairs. But eventually it does get dark outside and she still has not fallen asleep. And so she sits up in bed and she turns on the TV. And right away, the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote. But then she remembers the remote's in my hand. And so she's looking at the remote and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote. And the channels are still cycling. Now, Melissa had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs TV was connected to her upstairs TV and vice versa. If one was changing the channel, in real time, the other changed the channel. And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels are changing, it dawns on her that someone downstairs is changing the channels. And so frozen in fear, all she can think to do is turn off her TV because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off. And so in total darkness, in a house she's already terrified of, she is straining her ears to try to hear some sign that this is either something, someone's down there flipping through channels, or this is nothing, and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's sitting there, all she can hear is her own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her chest. But she doesn't hear any sounds in her house. She doesn't hear the TV on. She doesn't hear footsteps, doors opening, none of that. It's silence in the house. So after what probably felt like an eternity, she just grabbed a pillow and clutched it in front of her and put her head into the pillow and just laid like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning when she gets up, the sun is out and it's this huge relief because suddenly with the sunlight pouring in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself, you know what, that had to have been just some anomaly with the skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I got to tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens, that day she was going to a family birthday party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says, here's the strange things that are happening in my house with the skybox and all this. And at first, he looked at her like, really? This is what's going on? You're seeing ghosts in your house? But when she really focused on these specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the wall 2 separate times, and then the skybox thing. So the TV is kind of wrapped up in the weirdness that's been happening in her house and the missing items in her house. And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a little bit weird. and he offered to live with her for a few days and just see it for himself. And as they're talking, their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, "Oh, I'll stay there too." For 4 days, the two brothers lived on the first floor of Melissa's house, and they don't see anything, they don't hear anything, it's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so finally, when her brothers are getting ready to leave after the 4th day, she was practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea of staying in this house. Her brothers reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird, anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her standards. It was like 3 o'clock, so the sun's getting close to going down, so she needs to go upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips around her house to confirm everything is shut, everything is locked, no one's in the house, everything is safe. And then she goes upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room, she hears the unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor. And then she hears the TV turn on. And her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set really, really high. So as soon as the TV went on, it blared all through the house. And immediately the TV turned back off because whoever turned it on knew that that was going to wake up whoever was in the house. Melissa doesn't know what to do. Before, whatever the heck was happening in her house was a little bit subtle. It was like she had to think about what she was hearing to confirm it was actually happening. Now, this person is just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and flipping on the TV and blaring it through the house. And so she immediately is like, oh my God, what do I do? And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother. Then he picks up right away and she goes, someone is in the house right now. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear, and she gets up as slowly as she can, and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother pull up as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her eye her brother's car pulls up across the street, and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors, and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, and he pauses, there's silence on the phone, and she goes, what do you see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm going to hang up and call the police, and I'm going to call you right back. Now, Melissa knew what she heard was very real to her, but to have it confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole nother level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder in my house right now, confirmed. They are right downstairs, and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the police. Meanwhile, Melissa is just standing in this room, horrified, as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just walk over to her door and look through the keyhole, which was oversized on her door. And if you look through it and over to the left, you'd actually look downstairs to the first floor. You'd only see a sliver of the first floor. And so very carefully, she walks her way over to the door. And as she kneels down to look through the keyhole, her phone rings. It was in her pocket and it wasn't on silent. It was on loud, and it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone. She drops it on the ground. It's still ringing, and she finally silences it. And then reflexively, she pokes her head back and looks through the keyhole, and standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at her is a man with a hat pulled over his eyes who's clearly heard the sound, and he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs, and she hears this person who's in her house, because it was a voice she didn't recognize, screaming, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And then it's quiet. And so she opens that door because she wants to help if she can. And she looks and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding something. And he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head. And it's a frickin' knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy, and it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for months. They don't know how he got in, and he would never tell them, but he admitted that, yep, I was breaking in almost every single night. But he never gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister, but either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him. For listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, at the Amazon Music Follow Button's next birthday party, please gift them a 3-year supply of Radithor. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mrballen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mrballen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me,